7 cars, 0 excuses, all outlawed. Imagine spending years of your life chasing a single number. Not a lap time, not a trophy, a number. Elapsed time measured to the thousandth of a second, the one metric that decides whether you go home a legend or go home forgotten. You pour your money into it. You pour your marriage into it. You pour every waking hour into it. You build something so refined, so obsessively perfected, that it stops feeling like a car and starts feeling like a weapon aimed directly at the record book. You bring it to the strip. You line up. You destroy the field, run after run, week after week, until the results stop looking like competition and start looking like an execution. And then NHRA looks at the time slip, looks at your car, looks at you and says this cannot happen again. Not because you cheated, not because you broke a single rule written in that rule book, because you were faster than the people who wrote it ever imagined anyone could be. Today we are counting down 7 cars that ran so hard, so consistently, so far beyond what officials believed was mechanically possible, that NHRA had no choice but to write them out of existence. Number 7 will show you how a car nobody feared became a car nobody was allowed to race. Number 4 is the story of an engine so radical that the teardown crew stopped twice mid-inspection just to convince themselves what they were looking at was real. And number 1, the car that didn't just win a class, it ended one, permanently, and forced an entire sport to redefine what street legal was even allowed to mean. Stick around, because by the time we reach the end of this list, you will understand something most drag racing fans never learn. At NHRA, too fast was never a compliment. It was a death sentence, and these 7 cars all heard the verdict. Understand something before we start. NHRA didn't exist to stop innovation. On paper, the entire sanctioning body was built to protect it, to create a fair, structured environment where engineering brilliance could be measured, celebrated, and rewarded. But fairness only works when everyone is roughly playing the same game. The moment one team, one shop, one obsessive engineer figures out something nobody else has figured out yet, the entire structure is threatened. Not because the car is dangerous to drive, but because it's dangerous to the sport itself. A class where one competitor wins every single event isn't a competition anymore. It's a demonstration. And NHRA, whatever its officials said publicly, understood that a demonstration doesn't sell tickets, doesn't build rivalries, and doesn't keep a sport alive. So when a car got too good, the sanctioning body had exactly 2 options. Let it dominate until the class collapsed from lack of competition, or step in and change the rules underneath it. Every single car on this list is a story of officials choosing the second option, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, but always decisively. And every single one of these bans left a permanent mark on how the sport is regulated to this day. Some of these cars were banned in a single afternoon. Others took an entire off-season of closed-door meetings before anyone outside NHRA's technical committee even knew a change was coming. But in every case, the outcome was the same. The car that had been unstoppable on Sunday was, by the following event, no longer legal to even show up. Number 7. The 1964 Mercury Comet Cyclone factory lightweight. To understand why this car mattered, you have to understand what Mercury actually was in 1964. Not Ford, not Chrysler. The forgotten middle child of Detroit, a brand that built comfortable, unremarkable family cars for people who didn't care about horsepower. Nobody expected anything dangerous to come out of a Mercury badge, and that assumption is precisely what made the Comet Cyclone so effective. Mercury's skunkworks engineering team, working with almost no public attention, took the compact Comet platform and gutted it from the inside out. The front clip was swapped for fiberglass. The doors and deck lid went through an acid-dipping process that stripped away metal until the panels were dangerously thin, shedding pounds that would never show up on a factory spec sheet. Under the hood sat a 427 cubic inch high-riser engine, an engine so physically large that the hood itself had to be modified just to close over it. On paper, this was a modified compact sedan. On the strip, it was running times that nobody, not competitors, not spectators, not even some of Mercury's own dealers believed were coming from a car with that badge on the grille. NHRA tech inspectors clocked the weight during a routine post-race check and immediately knew something didn't add up. The published curb weight and the number the scale produced were separated by hundreds of pounds. Officials pulled the car aside, pulled the body panels, and found metal shaved down to thicknesses that existed nowhere in the NHRA rulebook because nobody had ever needed to write a rule against it before. There was no single moment of dramatic confrontation, no headlock, no shouting match in front of cameras, just a quiet, methodical process of reclassification that moved the Comet Cyclone out of its competitive class before the season even ended. Mercury had built a wolf wearing a family station wagon's clothing, and once NHRA understood what they were looking at, they made absolutely certain nobody would ever be allowed to try it again. The rule that followed specifically targeted acid dipping and aftermarket panel substitution, a regulation that racing historians still refer to informally as the Comet Clause. What made the Comet Cyclone case so uncomfortable for NHRA wasn't just the car itself, it was what it exposed about their entire inspection process. If a mid-tier manufacturer with a fraction of Ford or Chrysler's racing budget could sneak a car this radically modified past initial tech inspection, the obvious question became, what else had already slipped through undetected in other classes from other manufacturers over previous seasons? Some officials reportedly pushed for a retroactive audit of prior event results, a move that was quietly shelved once it became clear how much reputational damage that kind of investigation could cause the sport as a whole. The Comet Cyclone wasn't just banned. It became the reason NHRA's tech inspectors started arriving at events with scales calibrated to the ounce instead of the pound, a standard that persists in modified form even now. Number 6. Arnie Beswick's Tameless Tiger GTO. Arnie Beswick never had what the big factory teams had. No corporate backing, no unlimited engineering budget, no team of specialists flown in from Detroit. What he had was a small shop, a welding torch, and an obsession with making Pontiac horsepower do things Pontiac's own engineers had never signed off on. His GTO carried a stroked, overboard 421 cubic inch engine that Beswick built almost entirely by feel, adjusting tolerances through years of trial and error rather than factory blueprints. And here is what made him genuinely dangerous to the sport. It wasn't raw top-end speed that separated him from the field. It was consistency. Any car can run one blistering pass. Championships are won by cars that run the same blistering pass over and over, lights out, run after run, without deviation. Beswick's GTO did exactly that, and NHRA officials noticed the pattern almost immediately. After 3 consecutive event wins with suspiciously identical elapsed times, his engine was pulled for a full teardown, officials convinced they would find an illegal bore, an unapproved cam, something, anything that explained the numbers. They found nothing. No rule violated, no part out of spec, nothing that gave them legal grounds to disqualify a single run. What they found instead was a man who understood internal tolerances more precisely than the specification manual itself. Unable to touch him through enforcement, NHRA did something quieter and in some ways more consequential. The following season, the displacement formulas for his class were rewritten, closing the exact mathematical gap Beswick had spent years learning to exploit. He was never formally banned. He didn't need to be. NHRA simply engineered him out of existence. One committee meeting at a time, and the Tameless Tiger never ran competitive again under the rules that replaced it. There's a particular kind of injustice in Beswick's story that still frustrates historians who study this era. He never once had his engine seized as illegal. He never once received a suspension letter on paper. His entire NHRA record remains spotless. A career built entirely within the rules as they were written at the time. And yet the class he dominated simply stopped existing in the form that allowed him to compete in it. Independent shop owners across the country took notice. The lesson wasn't subtle. You could beat every team on the grid and still lose to the sanctioning body itself, because the sanctioning body always held the one advantage no engine block could outbuild: the rulebook. Number 5. The Sox and Martin 1968 Hemicuda. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin approached drag racing less like a sport and more like an assembly line. Every variable that could be controlled was controlled. Their Hemicuda ran a leaf spring rear suspension setup, tuned with a precision that competing teams initially assumed had to be some kind of hidden mechanical trickery. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't trickery. It was simply better engineering than anyone else in the pit lane had bothered to pursue. Ronnie Sox's reaction times off the starting line became a subject of open paranoia among rival teams. Run after run, event after event, landing within thousandths of a second of each other with a consistency that felt almost inhuman. NHRA officials began quietly pulling his timing slips for manual review, initially suspecting equipment malfunction rather than driver skill, because the alternative explanation that a human being was simply that precise seemed statistically implausible. The equipment wasn't malfunctioning. Sox was simply operating at a level nobody else in Pro Stock had reached yet. What ultimately forced NHRA's hand wasn't a discovered violation, it was the suspension geometry itself, a leaf spring configuration so effective at optimizing weight transfer under launch that officials eventually concluded no other team could compete against it without adopting the exact same setup, which would have collapsed the diversity of the class entirely. New suspension geometry restrictions followed, specifically targeting configurations like the one Sox and Martin had spent years refining. In the pit lane, mechanics gave the new regulation an unofficial nickname that stuck for years, the Sox Clause, a rule built around one team's advantage, written specifically to make sure nobody else could ever replicate it. What made this ban different from most of the others on this list is that it wasn't really about mechanical illegality at all. It was about competitive collapse. Rival teams began quietly threatening to pull out of events entirely if the suspension geometry wasn't addressed, arguing that a class where one setup guaranteed victory before the tree even finished cycling wasn't a class anymore. It was a coronation. NHRA officials found themselves in an unusual position, forced to regulate against a team that had broken absolutely nothing, purely to preserve the appearance of competition for everyone else on the entry list. Buddy Martin reportedly argued the point for weeks before the rule was finalized, insisting that punishing excellence set a dangerous precedent for every engineer in the sport. He wasn't wrong, but he lost the argument anyway, and the Sox Clause went into the books regardless. Number 4. The 1967 AMC Rambler Hurst SC. Almost nobody outside serious drag racing history remembers this car ever existed. And that obscurity is exactly why it belongs on this list. American Motors was the smallest of the major Detroit manufacturers, chronically underestimated, chronically overlooked, and George Hurst wanted to prove definitively that a humble compact economy platform could embarrass Ford and Chrysler's much larger performance divisions. The SC Rambler carried a 390 cubic inch weight crammed into a body that weighed almost nothing by comparison, a mismatch of power and mass that should have made the car nearly undrivable. Instead, it made it terrifying NHRA teardown crews, walking into inspection, expecting to find a mild street performance package, something roughly in line with what AMC's reputation suggested, instead found port work, compression ratios, and internal machining that had no business existing under the classification the car had been entered in. When officials pressed AMC's own engineers for an explanation, the answers they received didn't line up with what was physically sitting on the inspection table in front of them. The car was quietly reclassified twice within a single season, moved from class to class as officials scrambled to find a bracket where its performance made sense on paper. It didn't fit anywhere. Eventually, NHRA pulled it from sanctioned competition entirely, rather than continue the guessing game. And here's the part that made this car more dangerous than almost anything else on this list. A manufacturer nobody feared, working with a fraction of the budget of Ford or Chrysler, had built something officials genuinely could not explain. In a sport built on predictable, quantifiable engineering, the unexplainable was the single most threatening thing NHRA could encounter. And the Rambler delivered exactly that. George Hurst himself reportedly relished the chaos this caused inside NHRA's technical committee. His entire reputation had been built on outperforming expectations with unconventional partnerships. And watching officials scramble to classify a compact economy car nobody had taken seriously a season earlier was, by every account, exactly the kind of embarrassment he'd hoped to cause Detroit's bigger players. But the reclassification process had real consequences beyond bruised egos. Dealers who had ordered SC Ramblers specifically to compete found themselves suddenly locked out of the classes they'd built the car for, with no clear path forward and no refund policy to fall back on. It's a part of the story rarely told alongside the technical triumph. The ban didn't just end a competitive run. It stranded ordinary racers who had bought into a car nobody warned them would disappear from sanctioned competition within a single year. Number 3. Mr. Norm's 1969 Dodge Super Bee GSS. Norm Kraus didn't run a factory racing division. He ran a Dodge dealership on the north side of Chicago. And what came out of his service bay ran like it had Chrysler's entire corporate engineering budget quietly funding it. The GSS package dropped a 440 cubic inch six-pack engine into a Super Bee body that had never been structurally rated to handle that level of power. A combination that should have existed only on paper in some engineers' rejected proposal. Instead, Norm built it, sold it, and watched it consistently outperform cars coming directly out of Chrysler's official factory racing program. NHRA's problem wasn't the engine itself. Every component individually was technically legal. The problem was the paperwork and, more specifically, the precedent. Dealership-modified cars were never supposed to outperform factory-built ones. That hierarchy was assumed, unspoken, baked into how the entire classification system had been designed from the beginning. The GSS shattered that assumption publicly, loudly and repeatedly, forcing NHRA officials to spend an entire off-season locked in meetings trying to define, for the first time in the sport's history, exactly where the legal line sat between a factory-built race car and a dealership-built one. It was a distinction nobody had ever needed to formalize before, because nobody had ever needed to. New certification requirements followed almost immediately, closing a loophole that a car dealer from Chicago had discovered and exploited before Chrysler's own corporate engineers had even noticed it existed. Mr. Norm never worked inside the factory system. He simply outthought it from the outside, and NHRA had to rebuild part of its own rulebook just to catch up. There's an irony to this story that Norm Kraus himself pointed out for years afterward. Chrysler's own factory engineers had access to virtually unlimited testing resources, wind tunnels, dynamometers, entire departments dedicated to nothing but performance research. And it was a dealership on the north side of Chicago, working nights and weekends, that ended up embarrassing that entire apparatus on a public quarter mile. NHRA's new certification rules didn't just target Norm, they effectively closed the door on the entire category of dealership-modified factory racers, a business model that had quietly existed at the margins of the sport for years. Some smaller shops never recovered from the sudden regulatory shift, unable to compete once the loophole that had defined their entire operation was legislated out of existence overnight. Number 2. The 1971 Pro Stock Vega, known in the pit lane simply as malicious. Not every car on this list earns its place through raw speed. This one earns it through what a routine post-race inspection uncovered, and how quickly that discovery changed the sport. On the surface, the car looked like dozens of other Pro Stock Vegas competing that season, unremarkable stock appearing, nothing about the exterior suggesting anything unusual. But the numbers it was posting made no mathematical sense for its listed configuration. Elapsed times, consistent with a significantly larger, significantly more radical engine than what was documented on its entry paperwork. When NHRA officials finally pulled the block for a complete teardown, the internal modifications they found went so far beyond anything covered in the existing rulebook that inspectors reportedly stopped the process twice, not to double-check a measurement, but simply to confirm with each other that what they were looking at was actually real and not some kind of misassembled test mule. This wasn't a car that had broken an existing rule. It was a preview of engineering NHRA hadn't even conceived of yet, work so far ahead of the classification system that there was, quite literally, no regulation on the books it technically violated. The car was banned outright anyway. Its results struck from the record, and in the aftermath, NHRA's technical department built an entirely new inspection protocol from scratch, designed specifically around the exact techniques discovered inside that one engine block. One car, one teardown, and an entire generation of Pro Stock inspection procedure rewritten because of it. The nickname malicious wasn't official, and its origins remain disputed even among people who worked in that pit lane. Some say it came from a rival crew chief who muttered it under his breath after watching his own car get blown off the line by 2 full car lengths. Others insist it was painted. briefly in small lettering near the driver's door before officials asked the team to remove anything they considered provocative. What isn't disputed is the effect the discovery had on the sport's culture of trust. Prior to this teardown, pro stock inspections were largely built around spot checks and honor system compliance. Afterward, full mandatory teardowns became standard practice for any car posting times that deviated significantly from its class average. A level of scrutiny that fundamentally changed how every serious competitor prepared their engine from that point forward. Number 1. The 1965 Plymouth Belvedere race Hemi package. If every car on this list pushed against a boundary, this one didn't push against it, it erased it entirely. Plymouth's factory race Hemi Belvederes arrived from the assembly line acid-dipped, stripped of sound insulation, gutted of anything resembling comfort or civility, built around a 426 Hemi engine running in its most uncompromising street-legal configuration. These were not cars you drove to the grocery store. They were purpose-built race cars that happened to carry a title, a VIN number, and a thin legal justification allowing them to exist within a street-legal classification. When Belvederes began sweeping entire event classes, not occasionally, not on a good weekend, but consistently, systematically, across multiple regions and multiple driver lineups, NHRA officials stopped questioning individual runs and started questioning something much larger, whether factory manufacturers should be permitted to build anything this deliberately, unapologetically purpose-built ever again under the guise of a production vehicle. Emergency weight minimum regulations followed within weeks, not months. Documentation requirements tightened across every manufacturer competing in the sanctioning body. Not just Plymouth, a sport-wide correction triggered by one car's dominance. The Belvedere didn't simply get banned from competition. It forced NHRA to permanently, structurally redefine what the phrase street legal was even allowed to mean going forward, a definition the sport still operates under the shadow of today. What separates the Belvedere from every other car on this list is scale. This wasn't one team, one shop, one clever engineer finding a gap in the rulebook. This was Chrysler's full factory apparatus, deliberately, openly building race cars and selling them through dealership channels with barely a pretense of civilian use. When NHRA moved against it, they weren't just disciplining a single competitor. They were confronting one of the largest automakers in the country and telling them in effect that their entire factory racing strategy needed to change. Chrysler complied, but not happily. Internal correspondence from the period, later surfaced by racing historians, shows engineers arguing that NHRA's new weight minimums amounted to punishing success rather than regulating danger. NHRA held the line anyway. The Belvedere ran its dominant season, got banned, and in doing so drew a boundary line that every factory-built race car since has had to build around. 7 cars, 7 teams that outbuilt the rulebook before the rulebook had any chance of catching up to them. And here's what every single ban on this list actually tells you. Once you strip away the horsepower figures and the timing slips, NHRA was never really punishing cheaters. In every one of these 7 cases, no meaningful rule was broken until after the fact, until officials scrambled to write one specifically in response. What they were actually doing again and again was admitting they had been outsmarted. A dealership guy in Chicago outsmarted them. A shop owner with a welding torch outsmarted them. A team obsessed with leaf spring geometry outsmarted them. That is the real history of drag racing, underneath the noise and the spectacle. Not simply a story about speed, but a quieter, more relentless story about brilliant, stubborn engineers pushing against the edges of what was allowed, and officials scrambling, meeting after meeting, rule after rule, just to keep the sport recognizable. If you made it this far into the story, you already understand that this sport runs far deeper than most casual fans ever realize. Hit subscribe, because we are just getting started, and there are bans buried in this history that almost nobody talks about anymore. Think about what actually connects a Chicago dealership. A small, independent shop with a welding torch and one of the largest automakers in America. None of them set out to break the sport. They set out to win it, as completely and as decisively as their engineering allowed. The bans that followed weren't really verdicts on their character. They were confessions from the people writing the rules, an admission, quiet and reluctant every single time, that the sport's own boundaries had been drawn too narrow to contain what was actually possible. That tension between what officials are willing to allow and what engineers are capable of building hasn't gone away. It just moved. Every era of drag racing has its own version of these 7 cars, its own quiet dealership legend, its own overlooked shop that outthought a factory budget. Most of those stories never get told, buried in old tech sheets and disqualified timing slips that nobody thought were worth preserving. We think they're worth telling. If this list surprised you even once, there's a good chance the next one will surprise you twice.